Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to business continuity, disasters, crisis management, COVID, well-being, resilience, anything that can help you, your organization, or your community plan for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there, so I'm really easy to find, and we'll see about getting you on the show. If that doesn't work, you can find me through alexfullick.com. Now, longtime listeners and viewers, you'll know that I talked about the Continuity and Resilience Today conference that was virtual at the end of, I think it was early December 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And my hope was that we'd be able to get a couple of those speakers to come on the show and talk about their topic or expand on their topic. And today I'm lucky enough to have one of those speakers from CRT. On the topic of crisis management and crisis leadership, I'd like to welcome to the show Oliver Schmidt. Oliver, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Alex. Really appreciate it. And I look forward to our conversation.
Oh, you say that now. I haven't asked any questions.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I will be of the same opinion.
Yeah. Now, I know we've exchanged emails and I know a little bit about yourself, but just in case others that are listening and watching don't know who Oliver is, could you take a minute or two and talk about yourself?
Sure,
How you got into what you do.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So I actually hail from Europe, and back in the day, many moons ago, I studied business management, business administration, but also communication science. And I saw that there was an overlap between these two areas. And after a couple of different ways to make money, employment, I started my own company. That was back in 1998. At that time, I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. One of the three co-founders of C4CS. That is the business I run as the president and CEO. And from day one, we have specialized in two areas, if you will. And that's really the two areas that I know a lot about, if you will, at the end of the day. And that would be strategic communication on the one side, and on the other side, it's the crisis management work that we do that I speak about. And you mentioned continuity and resilience today, and that's I made two presentations there, and today we're going to focus, I believe, on the crisis management and leadership piece of the puzzle. Mm-hmm. And I do quite a bit of executive coaching in this area, so work with senior leaders, including CEOs of larger organizations, corporations, because crisis, and we're probably going to explore this quite a bit, is a different animal. You have the day-to-day management, and then a crisis starts, and all of a sudden it's this deer in the headlights thing, and senior leaders need direction and lots of other things. And I'm one of the probably growing number of advisors out there working with senior leaders or leadership teams. I do a lot of presentations to boards of directors, for instance, to assist with crisis management related tasks and solving problems, essentially.
Great. Well, I'm glad to have you here. This will be an interesting conversation, considering all the crises that are going on in the world right now. So
yeah, I think so too, Alex. Yeah.
Well, let's jump into what you were talking about at CRT. Mm-hmm. So my first question to you, because everybody seems to, I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people have different definitions. How do you define a crisis?
It's an adversarial event that can either happen all of a sudden, or it can be a so-called smoldering crisis, which is something that develops from an issue into a crisis. And it impacts, in my world and the definition that we use, a company's performance, and at the end of the day, the bottom line. The crisis communication or strategic communication part that I referenced earlier as one of my areas of expertise would be more related to reputational crises, or the reputational element of a crisis. Let's face it, in this day and age, we have a lot of social media related activities going on, and whenever something happens that may be completely limited to an operational problem, tires are falling off a vehicle or whatever it may be, there is a public communication element in all this, and that it needs further exploring, right? So we have internal audiences, external audiences, and that would be the strategic communication side. But generally speaking, we always say it's an adversarial event that potentially significantly impacts the performance of an organization. And that would be bottom line at the end of the day, but before that, it's certainly reputation that is affected, and stakeholder relationships. That's how we define it.
See, it never takes me long to go off script and shy away from the agenda. You mentioned a sudden, right? One of the definitions of a disaster is a sudden unplanned event.
Sure.
So how do you distinguish, or do you distinguish between a crisis and a disaster then?
For me, crisis is much more than a disaster, and a disaster would fall within the realm of what I define a crisis to be. And the disaster, I mean, we give people categories, right? So when I walk into a room and there is a group of senior executives, then there are questions along the lines of, as you asked, well, Oliver, what is a crisis? And one of the ways in which we describe the phenomenon crisis, if you will, is we give our clients categories or types of crises, and one would in fact be natural disasters. So there you have your sudden event, not man-made, which is another way to describe it or define it, right? There are man-made crises and ones that are not man-made. So a natural disaster, even though I have argued with people, including more recently, is climate change not man-made? Now, but I'm not going to get into the weeds there. So let's just say there is a natural disaster, and that falls within the category of non-man-made crises. And then it's always important to understand that there is much more than just a natural disaster or an industrial accident, because those are the things that most commonly are associated with the term crisis. But we're really talking about a wide variety of scenarios, and that may include anything along the lines of sexual harassment. It could be a financial fraud type scenario. So we work with forensics folks. We work with forensics folks actually also on the cybersecurity side of things. So a wide variety of scenarios, situations that we have dealt with in the past and that I have encountered throughout those about 30 years of my career.
Okay. Let's jump into something else you were talking about. 3 phases of crisis management. Now, the first one you identified is pre-crisis phase.
Yeah, so we utilize this as a model, again, for senior managers to understand where we're coming from. And we distinguish between the pre-crisis phase, the actual crisis as in response phase, and then we have the post-crisis phase. And during the pre-crisis phase, we want to anticipate. So we have a lot of prevention, obviously, as far as the focus is concerned. And it ties into risk management, where you identify threats and vulnerabilities. So the business continuity planning ties into that. And then you will obviously have, as the bulk of work that needs to happen during this pre-crisis phase, the preparation. So you want to get ready for the what ifs. And let's say you have identified, based on usually the likelihood of it happening and the potential severity as the 2 criteria that we look at. You have established a list of, let's say, the top 3 or 5 or 10. And then you go about preventing, and that will entail all kinds of things, from plan writing to training and so forth. But at a certain time, because the organizational life cycle has it that an organization, no matter how much in terms of resources gets put into the prevention side of things, a crisis will occur. So I actually have Ian Mitroff, a quote that I often include in my presentations. It's really not a matter of if it's going to happen. It's a question of when is it going to happen? What is it going to look like? And so forth, right? Yeah. But let's just say we reach the actual response phase, the crisis phase, then it's all about doing the right things in order to control, mitigate, and try to get a handle on things. So that would be the second phase. hopefully what we have done during the pre-crisis phase will now come to fruition, and we're able to deploy all of the different tools, plans, the training, as in skills that have been acquired by the personnel that's in charge of whatever they have been designated to do. And once we have things under control, we move into the post-crisis phase, and that's really about recovery, right? So because this process is cyclical, we would then also almost immediately talk about, well, this is the pre-crisis phase again. So let's utilize what we hopefully have in terms of intelligence gathered during the response phase, as in we have logs that we now go to and analyze the information that has been put down in terms of interactions with stakeholders, in terms of whether the steps that we took in order to control the crisis were actually effective. And based upon the after action reports and whatever else may flow into that process step, we then have a full-blown evaluation. And again, that leads us back to the pre-crisis phase, where we then make adjustments, where we change protocols, where we may reassign people and so forth, in order to be as best as possible prepared for the remaining what ifs, or a recurrence of what just happened to us.
And hopefully that doesn't happen.
Well, it does, right? So we mentioned
Yeah,
natural disasters. I certainly have clients that have been struck by a hurricane, different facilities, not just once, but multiple times. And that certainly also applies to other crisis scenarios. As I mentioned earlier, the different categories.
Yeah.
It's certainly possible for a company to have any number of, for instance, cybersecurity related incidents, right? And be a cyber attack and malware victim maybe within a month or so. So that's not unheard of these days, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I've got a couple of questions for you based on what you said. We talked because you mentioned natural disasters. I'll just say earthquake.
Sure.
So there's an earthquake that happens in an area, and multiple organizations experience, obviously, some sort of crisis, devastation, whatever. And you talked about contain and control. When you're controlling and containing the situation, are you just looking at it from yourself, or do you need the partnerships of those other businesses that have been impacted as well to work together to be able to get control of the situation?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned a natural disaster, earthquake. Definitely, we're all about forming partnerships ahead of time. There's not a single, let's go with the example, chemical company that based on our recommendation or long before we entered the scene, developed very good relationships with the fire brigade in the area. I mean, outside of having the own fire service on site, that's a must, right? And there are other relationships that need to be formed, and certainly even potentially with competitors, we will work very closely if there is a crisis that affects not just us, but also other organizations, geographically speaking, in that same area, or ones that belong to our group of companies within a certain sector, or organizations within a certain sector. By all means, whatever we can do in order to, as you said, contain and control, we'll be right there. Now, obviously, we cannot disregard any certainly legal limitations or whatever else may stand in the way of collaborating with a certain third party. But I'm a firm believer in pooling resources, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, it also makes, let's put a happy face on this. If you're seen to be helping others in stressful times too, it looks good for you in your brand.
Well, and right? I mean, one example that goes way beyond just servicing a particular client, and in our case, usually corporations. We work very closely and have for many years with what's called in the US, the Local Emergency Planning Committee for the county we were headquartered in. And that is really a perfect example of a collaboration that extends the corporate world and includes municipalities. I mean, the FBI is in the boat. It's all these different entities and at the end of the day, government agencies and so forth that collaborate. And this is an approach that has helped many an organization in our area. Now, Pittsburgh, where I'm based, is not that natural disaster prone. So it's not like we have earthquakes here and so forth. There's maybe some flooding, but outside of that, not too much is happening here. But still, there are needs, and they can be met via these collaborations. I've seen it myself many times, and I am, as I said, definitely very much in favor of it, no doubt.
Great. My other question had to do with the after action report or the lessons learned. Would you recommend doing those periodically throughout a crisis or waiting to the end? And the reason I ask that is I've been in some situations where you have leadership and they see, because they come through the crisis, good or bad, whatever it was, they end up with rose-colored glasses, saying, hey, we did great, we came out of it, got a few things to do, but hey, wonderful, let's just move forward. Or you've got the leadership sitting in the room with daggers in their eyes, trying to find blame and penalize somebody, for causing the situation. So what are your thoughts on when some of these lessons learned or after action reports get done? What are your thoughts?
I'm a huge proponent of evaluation ongoing during crisis. So there's no point in fact, that's one of the ways in which I distinguish anything that happens during a crisis from, let's say, a marketing campaign that a company does, right? So we do a campaign. At the end of the campaign, we look at the results and we're happy because the numbers are great or they're not so great. During a crisis, we have to adapt on a potentially minute-by-minute basis. And in order to be able to do the right thing every minute of the hour, every hour of that particular day, we obviously need to reassess. We need to continuously monitor. One of the services that I find crucial in that regard is, and I mentioned the communication side, reputation management side of things earlier, is effective automated internet and media monitoring. And that can be extended to other stakeholders too. I mean, whereas we're picking up social media posts, we have all kinds of other parties in the mix and not just the traditional media. And in order to be informed what's happening out there, who is impacted in what way, it's critical to know all these things that are going on. I mean, sticking with a natural disaster type scenario, how are we ever going to know who might need to be evacuated in a remote area, remote from where we are right now, if we don't monitor and don't communicate with folks there? And ideally, that should be two ways. So I'm not just talking about looking at posts or receiving information, but we should be in touch. There should be two-way communication going on so we understand, again, on a minute-by-minute basis, what is actually happening and how can we provide the best support and advice also that would be available in any given situation.
I like what you just said about communication needs to be both ways. Communication needs to be dialogue. If it's one way, it's just monologue. I've been saying that for years.
Without the feedback, you will not be able to do best by whatever stakeholder group. I use stakeholder group. I mean, from a communication side, it would be an audience or public or whatever. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you are providing a service to an organization, whatever your role may be in that realm, and you need to see to it that everyone is included. You can't just give you that example. You work with a company, they have a crisis on their hand, and all of a sudden you forget about the sales team, which is not at headquarters, which is out there, and they're left to their own devices, right? That's not good. Also, in terms of messaging, you mentioned communication. I mean, if there's no communication with the sales team, what are they supposed to say if a concerned customer asks them what's going on? Why are you not providing the service or delivering the goods for us at this time? What's happening? So all of this needs to be very well gelled, and that's certainly only the case if there is two-way communication or a dialogue, as you said, Alex.
Yeah. Otherwise, those sales people will start making things up on their own, and before you know it, your leadership has another crisis to deal with.
That is very true and has often happened in my experience, that we are creating crises where there were none before because we don't have our ducks in a row. And that may be related to communication. That could be because we're not taking care of the initial operational problem sufficiently, and whether that's a spill or whatever it may be. And there are after effects. It's a cascading thing. You then have to deal with a host of additional problems potentially, and you're still not finished with dealing with the thing that happened initially. That's certainly a possibility as well.
Well, let's look at something else. Obviously, everybody knows we've been going through, hopefully at the tail end of a global pandemic. What's changed with crisis leadership? Or better yet, how did COVID change leadership?
I think it changed it. Yeah, it actually did change it quite a bit from where I sit. And I say that because I mentioned earlier that I've provided executive coaching services in addition to consulting with corporations, primarily corporations. And COVID has actually had a positive effect in that management teams tend to be more open to having discussions in regard to prevention and preparedness planning. So the readiness aspect has been highlighted by COVID. I have conversations sometimes with the same leaders who, let's say 2.5 years ago, were very reluctant to even have any type of communication specifically geared toward the preparedness aspect. And you talk to them about crisis readiness, and they said, well, sure enough, we're ready because I have 3 people working on it and I pay them handsomely. And that would not have been a sufficient answer, obviously. But now we're getting more granular in terms of the investigation of where are we within this process? And Oliver, what does this process even look like? Could you explain this a little bit? And that's when I talked earlier about the 3 phases, that would be one of the things that we make very clear, that it never ends. So the preparedness planning process, the increasing readiness, organizational crisis readiness, that's an ongoing task. And you can't just say, okay, we're going to be dormant for the next 3 years and still expect to be prepared. That it just doesn't work that way. Now, there were companies, Alex, and this is the flip side of the coin, where unfortunately, as a result of a lot of economic strain caused by the pandemic, despite the fact that management realized there is a need for proper planning and so forth, they simply were unable as a result of budget cuts and so forth. But even in those kinds of situations, we were able to talk to the management teams and say, let's keep this on our radar, however, because we will get through this. As you said earlier, maybe this is hopefully tail end and there's the endemic status approaching, coming up soon for us. At that time, we will certainly revisit these things. And as we provided assistance during the pandemic, we obviously took advantage of the fact that we had exposure, that we were able to talk to people about supply chain related problems, COVID-19 testing and vaccination, the reputational aspects of it, as well as the operational calamities involved in that regard. And we're on their radar at this point. I guess that would be a good term to use here.
That's a good thing.
And that's a good thing. I mean, let's face it, we do not immediately produce anything that adds to the bottom line in our line of work, right? What we do is we help companies avoid disaster, but we can certainly not say within the next 3 months you will have a crisis, and if you don't do X or Y or Z, you're going to lose $50 million or whatever. That's impossible, right? We're not fortune tellers. So we need to find a way to talk about the what ifs in a way so that senior management can relate what we're saying to their own experiences. And my point is that was a lot easier during the pandemic and continues to be easier because we're not through it. And management teams, including CEOs, are open to having these conversations, more so in many cases, at least, compared to pre-pandemic times.
Yeah, I wonder if we'll ever be impacted by a disaster or a crisis.
Right.
Thinking should be gone because everybody was impacted.
And they also understand, and that's really a positive development there too, Alex. It's not just about plan writing, right? I mean, we all preach the duality of things. We need to have processes in place and plans and so forth. But if we do not conduct recurring training, we can have all kinds of plans, and we can revise the plans on a weekly basis, maybe even. Yeah. But we're not going to be able to mount an effective response because nobody has ever done it. And that's why, and even if it's just a tabletop exercise, as if we're not doing a full-blown drill or a semi-live or whatever, that helps tremendously. So we have done more tabletops also because it's a lot easier to do a tabletop via Zoom or using another platform. And it's very effective. We're preparing a couple of tabletops right now, and companies or clients decided not to go back to an in-person format, but at least for now to stick with the video conferencing format, because they found during the pandemic this actually works. We don't have to be in the same physical location. It's much more convenient, and certainly a lot of people are talking about the fact that video conferencing is here to stay, and I certainly agree, and it applies in a certain way to our discipline, if you will, and in particular, among other things, when it comes to the training aspect.
Yeah, I've also found it's easier to schedule, believe it or not.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I know that sounds weird, but it's actually true.
No, I agree. I agree, Alex.
On that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. Today, we're talking with Oliver Schmidt about crisis leadership and crisis management, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Today, we are talking about crisis leadership and crisis management with Oliver Schmidt. Oliver, in your CRT presentation, you had a diagram with a triangle where you talked about three functional areas that need to come together during a crisis. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, sure. I use that often, and like to put emphasis on the fact that any organizational response to a crisis, whatever crisis it may be, will not be successful unless you have a team effort put in place. And this particular graphic that I use shows three different areas, response areas at the end of the day, that need to work hand in hand. And the first is what I refer to as managerial response. That essentially means the decision making. So that's the leadership, and we talk about leadership today, Alex. That's the decision making that needs to be in place in order to hopefully, in a timely manner, in a concise manner, move forward as far as the response is concerned, right? And it all starts with decision making, because if nobody knows what to do because no decisions have been made, we're never going to be able to contain and control. That's just it. Mm-hmm. And coaching leadership through this rapid fire response in terms of the need to decide potentially much quicker compared to a day-to-day scenario, right? Where you have lots of meetings and then you call a couple of advisors and maybe in 2 days you have your decision as the CEO. Here you might have 2 minutes, and it's a completely different ballgame, completely different. So it's about the decision making that has to be in place, and hopefully in a flawless fashion. And that needs to be coupled, which is the second area, with the operational response. What do I mean by that? That's all of the activities that flow out of the decisions that have been made in order to implement what has actually been decided. Let's just say it's an engineering related problem. I can't just talk that away. I actually need to fix something. So I need to get the engineers to work and everybody else who is involved in this process. And then at the end of the process, we hopefully will be in a position to tell everyone, we have been able to fix this. And then we would want to describe what we've actually done and so forth. You know? And that leads me to the third area. So it's the managerial response, it's the operational response, and then it's the communication response. And 1 and 2 are not going to work if I have the third area, the communication response tying into the other two areas and really enabling the decision making and then the operational response. Because if I do not communicate effectively with internal stakeholders, I won't be able to fix things. And if I don't communicate with external stakeholders, I may have all kinds of problems because they no longer trust me. The stakeholder trust is diminished or even almost completely gone in many cases. And that's something we want to avoid. You know? So that's why I show it's essentially 3 triangles. It's the managerial response, the operational response, and the communication response, which does include internal, external, and then also social media, if you will, so anything online.
Okay. And you talked about impact assessments.
Yes.
What does that involve? Now, obviously, in business continuity, I know
Sure.
what a BIA is, but
right.
in a crisis, how do you do
Yeah, so this is a little different from a business impact analysis, where I'm coming from there. Again, talking to leadership teams, folks who run large organizations, it's often important, in fact, essential to remind them that the way they see the world as they're sitting around that large table discussing important matters for the organization may be fundamentally different from how the general public or specific stakeholder groups on the outside of the organization view the exact same problem as in an ongoing crisis. So while management may say, well, we understand the magnitude of this. We have analyzed the impact. We have numbers. We also knew what the probability was. We can talk about facts related to it. We understand what the consequences are. And then obviously the attorneys will chime in, whether they're in-house or not, and say, well, we really need to address liability here. So we shouldn't say anything at this time. We're in fact-finding. We're in the process of going through fact-finding, and let's just see how things go. And what they don't realize is that they have a huge problem, potentially at least, on their hands already, because there are not just one, but several stakeholder groups up in arms over what has happened and continues to expire potentially at this time. So what I need to do as a consultant in terms of the leadership angle is to make them aware of a different view. And that view would be the stakeholder view, or you could also call it the affective or emotional view, as opposed to the management's more technical and analytical view, right? And for that, I give them examples of stakeholders protesting, of people on social media trolling the company, potentially following an incident that may have happened 2 years ago, because they won't forget. They were personally affected, and therefore they don't let up. And that's something that's very different, because it's no longer about the facts, the magnitude, and all these things that we can, in theory at least, measure quite accurately. It will be about stakeholder perception, and that's a very different animal. That really asks us to look at the individual out there, not just a group, because the group is not it's not homogenous, right? There's all kinds of different views within that one stakeholder group. So we need to understand, how do these stakeholders tick? What are their issues? There is a term, stakeholder analysis, that feeds into that. And then we need to understand what stakeholder outrage is, because there are those stakeholders who are sort of neutral. They are not emotionally affected, and they say, hey, so what? Now, they might read about it in the news. But then you have this portion of stakeholders who are up in arms, is an expression I used earlier, and they may actually already protest. So while I'm talking to a senior management team in the boardroom or wherever, online meeting during the pandemic, they say, yeah, we had this happen to us, and we really don't know. And I mentioned cybersecurity earlier, which is even more difficult at times to get into the heads of executives. Yes, you see yourself as a victim here because somebody committed a criminal act and breached your system. But at the end of the day, the perception, and that's what counts, that your stakeholders have, is something you need to incorporate into your thinking now. And to them, you are the villain, not someone who is breaching your system and is stealing data. And then let's just say it's a ransomware scenario, whatever. It is you who did not take proper care of the information that is now lost. And that information, unfortunately, pertains to those out there who are now very angry at you. And there needs to be a switch flipped, right? There needs to be an understanding created on the part of management teams or managers as individuals. I'm not saying it's I don't want to come out with a blanket statement that nobody understands. That's certainly not true. But you usually have a few at least that are on the fence and say, really, Oliver, is that important? I say, yes, it is. Because if you don't take care of this problem right now, this may mushroom, and then you have a second crisis on your hands. You have a reputational crisis on your hands. Again, while you may still be battling the original problem, because your cybersecurity issue, for instance, is not going to go away within the next 24 hours. You need to go through the mandatory notifications and so forth, and then forensics will come in. This is going to take potentially a long time. But if you make people angry now and you don't talk to them, dialogue, as we said earlier, Alex, they will be against you, potentially some of them at least indefinitely. And that's something you don't want, because that could be customers / clients, that could be your vendors, that could be other external stakeholders, but also internal stakeholders. What if you lose talent? What if you have a problem with recruiting as a result of whatever it is that happened? So a double whammy. Not only are you having people who leave, who jump ship, you also have problems getting the pipeline filled again, because they're saying, no, we're not going to work for this organization, right? Their values are just not in line with what I stand for and what I believe in. And that has a lot to do with how you, reputationally speaking, respond to the issue from a communication perspective. But that doesn't leave out the operational response. You still need to fix this thing, right? If you don't, then you lose anyway, if you will.
Well, that kind of leads into one of the next things I wanted to talk about. You talk about key messages or a message triangle.
Yes. Yeah, I use in my work a message triangle. And again, this is a little more on the reputation management side, of course, but very important to remind management teams, managers, leaders of organizations, no matter the size or geographic scope, whatever, that at the end of the day, they need to communicate three things succinctly when it comes to addressing internal and external stakeholders in times of crisis, but certainly also outside of the crisis. But it's even more important during a crisis, and that would be facts, feelings, and actions. And that's the triangle that I use in my work, right? So it would have facts, feelings, and actions. And what do I mean by that? Well, number one, you need to know facts, first of all. So that's your intelligence gathering that goes into the response to a crisis, phase 2 that we talked about earlier. And then you need to utilize those facts, because it's not just about knowing the facts yourself. You need to actually communicate them, obviously internally, because if your engineers don't know that there is a problem, how are they ever going to be able to fix it? But that's only the start of things, because you then also need to answer questions from employees, from external stakeholders. There's the dreaded media, right? So that's a big unknown for a lot of executives I work with, where there is then coaching needed along the lines of media interview skills and so forth. And in addition to facts, and this is where I often run into hurdles, we need to be mindful of the fact that it's about empathy, and that's the feelings component. Because if I, as an organization, and I log heads with lawyers there fairly regularly, I'm not talking about admitting guilt. That's not what this is about, which would then lead to open us up to liability and so forth. It's about coming across as human and not being cast as the villain right off the bat, because we sound weird, we sound mechanical, we sound artificial. We do not relate to people's feelings, and that's a problem, a huge problem. And that's why that reminder is so important. And it really comes down to being empathetic. It's the empathy piece of the puzzle that helps us tremendously. And lastly, if we say things that we mean, but we don't follow up in terms of actions, we're not going to be successful. So if I talk to whatever stakeholder group it may be, and I potentially even make a promise, but then don't follow through, well, that's going to fly right back into my face. And that's the action part. So facts, feelings, actions, the triangle that you referenced, Alex, these three things need to come together. And if they don't, if only one of these components is missing, then we do have a problem.
Well, when it comes to leadership, who should be the one showing the feelings? Because a lot of times you see a media spokesperson, and you said, you mentioned legal.
Right.
A lot of times the media spokesperson is reading a script that's come from communications and legal.
Right. So first of all, again, it's not only external communication, it starts internal, right? So if I don't have in place proper communication with internal audiences, and let's just say it's primarily employees, you might throw in the board of directors or retirees or whatever, according to whatever definition you might use. But it has to be situation specific. You were asking me who needs to be the communicator. I often get these questions, and a CEO might ask, well, it's not my job. That's why I have 15 spokespeople or whatever. And that may be true. But let's face it, if the magnitude of the crisis at hand demands that at a certain point, at least, senior leadership address the issue and be in touch with specific stakeholders, especially those that are personally impacted, then it is your job as a CEO to be available, to make yourself available. And if if 60 Minutes or whatever other TV format TV program calls, you can't just say, well, I'm going to let this handle the assistant to my second spokesperson or whatever. That's just not going to work. So it's a matter of carefully analyzing the situation, and based on experience, and that's where we come in as consultants, Alex, because we've done it many times, and we can advise our clients accordingly. And that may very well include helping designate specific people who will then perform tasks, including, for instance, communication in the area of leadership internally, but also addressing external stakeholders.
I guess it's also the context of the situation as well, because you mentioned, 15 spokespeople. Okay, we had an application that crashed and people were impacted. Maybe a spokesperson is fine for that one. However, you manufactured some pharmaceutical or a food product that made a whole bunch of people sick, or maybe even worse. That's obviously should not be coming from a spokesperson, right?
Yeah. Well, again, it has to be situation specific. And as I said earlier, we have to keep in mind that the severity of the event, the impact will determine. And that's again, I said it earlier, you were asking me about evaluation. My answer was it's ongoing, right? So I might talk to a senior manager, a member of the C-suite, or a small organization, could be the owner of a private company, whatever. And I say, let's just not have you address the media. And there's a collective relief immediately visible on his or her face. But I may call half an hour later and say, hey, the situation has drastically changed. And for reasons A, B, C, maybe even more, we now need you here in order to do X or Y or Z, which again may include addressing either internal audiences. I mean, we're talking about large companies, right? So we may have a scenario unfolding where a senior leader now has to talk via a video conference to potentially tens of thousands of people, because that's how large the organization is, right? When we're saying, oh, it's just internal, I would caution people, large organizations with senior leadership involved in a response to get the internal end online, you may be talking to tens of thousands of people. And that's not easy to begin with, potentially, for some folks, much less so in a crisis situation.
Well, we only have about 3 minutes left, just over 3 minutes left. And I meant to ask you a question earlier regarding decision-making. What are your thoughts of leadership trying to make every single decision, in the boardroom versus those that are on the front lines that need to make some decisions? What are your thoughts on where that boundary should exist? Who makes what?
Good question, Alex. It's a fine line. And again, my answer definitely is it's situation specific. So unless I know all of the facts, I would not be able to, and I don't think it would be professional, as a matter of fact, to advise that A or B is the right thing to do. But there are certain situations that I come across fairly regularly where I'm actually discouraging senior management to take on too much. Number one, they have day-to-day things that they need to do, right? Running the company takes obviously a lot of time. And now you have this pile on top of everything else. That's why we have the person at the helm of the crisis response team, crisis management team, whatever it may be called, being someone completely different. It shouldn't be, as a matter of fact, the CEO. That's someone we pull in at certain junctions when the situation requires. But it would be somebody very different to lead this team and then on an as-needed basis pull in executives and experts, topical experts, and so forth. So I guess what it boils down to is this. I have been in situations where I have asked senior leadership to be more involved, including CEOs, situation specific. And I've been in situations where I have proactively worked toward relieving senior management and pushing things over to the rank and file, if you will, within the different functional areas. Because let's face it, if I need an IT expert, then I need an IT expert. If I need that engineer, I need the engineer. If I have an HR related problem, then I will be talking to HR, and I want for senior leadership to move in that direction as far as the thought process is concerned, including designating people to actually take on specific tasks. And a CEO, while certainly very knowledgeable, experienced, and so forth, will never be able, and I say that to people right into their face when it comes to it, even in a little more adversarial type situation potentially. Yes, you came through the CFO function, let's say, but does that mean that you're the right person to address these things? First of all, it's potentially way too granular. And then there is also a possible problem attached to a scenario where the CEO thinks that he or she is in charge of everything and knows everything, or at least wants to know everything and do everything, and it just doesn't work. So we need to be mindful of those two extremes, if you will, and work toward the middle.
And on that note, we've come to the end of the show. Oliver, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and time with us today. I know you weren't feeling that well today, but you certainly wouldn't know it.
Very good. I'm
obviously
glad. Yeah.
You're obviously quite passionate about crisis leadership and crisis management. So
I sure am. And I hope that is something that the audience also was able to pick up.
Oh, I think they got it. I know I can feel it.
Very good, Alex. Yeah.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Hopefully feel better soon. Have a great day. And everybody watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody.
Very, very nice chatting with you, Alex. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.